First of all, I've already had my say at the podium, and I appreciated that at the top of this symposium. So I'm going to stay where I am and briefly introduce our panelists. But just a couple of things. First of all, today has been stunning. I rarely have seen, and we've all been to many, many symposia, and our Great Law Review has put on many symposia. I don't think I've ever seen one as spirited and passionate and heartfelt as this one. So once again, students, we're supposed to inspire you, supposedly. Yet again, you inspire us. Thank you. The second thing I want to say, Lino, I swear to God, I'm not looking to get into a debate, okay? So buckle up. First of all, I do appreciate Larry, Robert, and Lino having been here today, because I think there are many of us who do see eye to eye on things. For example, I was incredibly moved by President Cantor's, Chancellor Cantor's setup of this whole event. And basically, the sentence that it reverberates in my head, although it's a paraphrase, is that the fate of the Republic hangs in the balance. That's how strongly I feel about what the court may now do in Fisher. So I appreciate the diverse voices, if I may use that phrase, because I think it's generated great conversation. But there's one point that I really feel I have to respond to, and it was the comment about the root cause of the problem being poor black performance on test scores. With all due respect, that is not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is slavery, structural racism built into our Constitution, and 100 years of Jim Crow that we're still struggling today. And the result of that is that America has a problem, and America has to figure out how to resolve that problem. And the nature of the remedy cannot be fashioned without paying attention to history. And Lino, you and I can have a scotch or something later and we can argue about it. But I do want to now introduce my friends, first of all, and also my colleagues. First of all, John Powell. I am so honored that John is joining us today. John now is the professor of law and also African American Studies at Berkeley. He's also the director of holds the Robert Haas Chair in Equity and Inclusion and directs the Haas Diversity Research Center. I think almost everybody in this room, or many in this room, are very aware of John's work, his Center for Race and Poverty in Minnesota, his global approach to all these issues that plague us today. And John, to say it's an honor to have you here would be an understatement. I would be remiss if I did not say that John was also on the faculty at the University of San Francisco early in his career, and we are lesser for the fact that he is no longer with us. And to my right is somebody who's become a good friend and a close colleague, and that's Frank Wu, who's the Chancellor and Dean at Hastings. Frank was a professor at one of the great law schools in the history of America, Howard University, also the Dean at Wayne State, and now, as I said, the Chancellor and Dean at Hastings. Frank has written extensively in the area of race and race relations in America, focusing to some extent on Asian Americans and race relations, a book entitled Yellow Race in America and Beyond Black and White, and also co-authored Race Rights and Reparations. So we are very, very lucky to have these two gentlemen here. And the focus now is going to be what to do about it. I guess Jay raised that issue, you know, whether it's in the context, Jay, that you just mentioned at the close of your talk, but what's next, assuming that Fisher goes the way many of us think it will. But rather than preempt any comments, let's start first with John. John, welcome, and if you'd like to use the podium, feel free to do that.
So first of all, Jeff, how long do I have?
Catherine, how long is John?
So she said we're negotiating, 15, half an hour? Okay, well, anyway, it's a delight to be here, and in all candor, I wouldn't be here except that it is here. I have a crazy schedule. I, go for weeks, if not months at a time without getting a day off. And so when I got an invitation to come and yet again speak, I was inclined to say yes, or say no rather, until I saw it was from Jeff and USF. And it was really just a delight to sort of launch much of my legal career here at USF with Jeff and Chuck Lawrence and Trina Grill and Stephanie Wildman and John Denver. I mean, it was some of those people you may not know, but it was like, it was actually an interesting time because it was such a wonderful space. And, I was fairly young, and I think this is really wonderful, and people went off to different places. I thought it would repeat at some point in life, and I was wrong. It's like I've gone to great places. I've had a chance to teach at Harvard for a minute and Columbia, but nothing like the time I spent at USF. And Jeff is part of that and still part of that, so it's a delight to be back. So I'm going to actually just touch on a few things, and if you could let me know when I'm down my last 3 or 4 minutes. You're actually dealing with really complex questions, and I want to make it more complex. I have a PowerPoint that I'm not going to show you, but it really is good. Part of the difficulty in terms of this issue is that it's not a singular issue, and I would recommend the book The Imperative of Integration by Elizabeth Anderson, and she talks about 4 different models of affirmative action. She talks about a compensatory model. She talks about a diversity model. She talks about sort of a correcting decisions model, and then a democratic model. And she goes through and sort of tries to look at how each one actually renders very different results, very different foundations, and very different aspirations. And we sort of mix these things up. And so part of the thing that's important is sort of to unpack what assumptions that we're making. And of course, I was thinking when I was listening to some of the talks today, I was thinking, if you take a snapshot of any given moment in time, if you take a snapshot of a person, it would tell you nothing. You need to know where people have been, where they're going, what their family is. And part of the problem with the way we think about affirmative action and the way the court, at least some of the members of the court think about affirmative action, is they divorce it from everything else. And so it's like, okay, we got an 18-year-old kid who wants to go to college, and we've devised a test. We don't know if the test, how good the test is, or bad the test is, but it's a test. And we're going to use that to distribute what apparently is scarce social resources. Johnson had it right. You don't sort of take someone to a starting line with shackles and with depleted and no food and say, now we're going to have a race, and it's going to be fair. We're not going to consider anything except who wins the race. And that's sort of what we do. And I think this is what one of the speakers was talking about in terms of the advantage that we get because of our station in life. And part of the difficulty also is, and I've written some on this, race is incredibly complex. And we actually don't know what we mean by race. And the court has sort of latched on to that at some point. And sometimes it latches onto that in favor of SES or class. It's like, Scalia yelling at counsel, what is race? And the counsel being stuttering, not being able to answer. Is it blood? And of course, it's not blood. What is it then? What is race? And the social scientists have taught us the race is socially created, is socially constructed. What they haven't taught us, or what we haven't learned, is that everything is socially constructed, including the self. And so I've written some, and while there are people who would argue we shouldn't do race because it's not biologically grounded, that it's socially constructed. Instead, we should do something else. I said, no one has argued that we shouldn't do the self. Let's stop doing the self. It's a fiction. There's actually a book called The Illusion of the Self. The self is compounded and incredibly complex, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It doesn't mean it's not socially real. It's not biologically real. And if we sort of think about what are the social practices? So if we say race is socially constructed, what are the practices that construct race? And what are the practices that construct race? It's not one thing. It's not SES. It's not even slavery. It's all these factors coming together. Where we live, language, separation. And the construction of race is not a construction of black people. It's a construction of all of us, and particularly whites. And without that understanding, we sort of confuse the discussion. It's like, why are we talking about the color of someone's skin? Of course, we're not. Homo plessy was phenotypically white. We're talking about something else. And we're talking about that something else without naming it. We're talking about SES. We're talking about culture. We're talking about neighborhood. We're talking about family. We're talking about access to resources. We're talking about segregation. We're talking about our history and our aspirations without ever saying it. So I'm going to at least touch on, I want to give you some numbers. And Rachel will know these numbers, so she can't say, but anyone other than Rachel, if you know these numbers, I want you to tell me what you think they are. So the first number is 40. There are four numbers. The first number is 40. The second number is 11 million. The third number is 10 to the 80th power. That's 10 with 80 zeros after it. And the last number is 10 to the millionth power. That's 10 with a million zeros after it. So if you think you know the answer to all four of those, raise your hand, and if you get all four right, you get free tuition. That's what Jeff said. So does anyone have any sense of what all four of those numbers are? So here's what these numbers are. 40. 40 is the number of things you can process, the number of bytes you can process in 1 second consciously. 40 bits of information. 11 million is the number of bits of information you process in a second unconsciously. So you process 40 of them consciously, 11 million unconsciously. 10 to the 80th power, the number of atoms in the universe. 10 to the millionth power, the number of computations that your mind is capable of making. Now, why am I talking about this in the context of affirmative action in this symposium? When we talk about what's going on in our mind, we're talking about the 40. We're not talking about the 11 million. And what research shows is that not only are we affected by what's going on in the other 11 million, what's going on behind our back, how we feel, how we think, how we evaluate, how we perform, stereotype threat, priming, all these things are happening behind our back. And race is critical. We can measure it. We don't have to ask someone. So we know that people have tremendous racial anxiety. And this is not just true of black Americans. In some ways, it's more true of white Americans. And I bet you're dying to a donut that we don't have the same kind of anxiety around SES. So when people say, why are we talking about race? I never think about race. Well, the you that never think about race is the 40. The 11 million is constantly thinking about race. And it's consequential. So the structures that we live in internally, the mind, and externally, the space, is arranged to actually produce and reproduce racial meaning and racial outcomes. And so when we say we're not going to pay attention to all of that, we're just going to look at the individual, it's a fraud. It simply doesn't exist. And if you do the work in terms of mind science, and Rachel does, and I do, and some of you may, most of it's not about race. But it profoundly shifts the way we understand what it means to be a person. And it profoundly shifts the way we would think about in terms of what we need to do to be fair. And just one other sort of interesting footnote. The unconscious, where all this work is going on, is largely social, not private. These are social cues, social mechanisms, social associations that we make from our environment. So they have profound effect on who we are and how we navigate the world. So going forward, so this talk is supposed to be what's next. Obviously, we don't know. There's a split on the Supreme Court. It's 4-4-1. And that can shift very easily. The Supreme Court will be noodling this around for a long time. But it's incoherent that the Supreme Court can both say it's irrelevant that students are in deeply segregated educational space and race shouldn't matter. And these spaces belie the claim that race shouldn't matter. This space is organized around race. And the organization of space around race is not the experience of most urban poor whites. So when you're looking at the sort of, and again, as Rachel said, it's not socioeconomic versus race. When you look at these things, it's multiple factors that define who we are. SDS is one of them, but it's just one. And so the experience of blacks, and certainly low-income blacks, and Gunnar Myrdal wrote this in 1943. He didn't have a big dog in the fight. He was Swedish. And he wrote The American Dilemma. And he noticed at the time, he said, the situation of the poor Negro and poor white in the United States is fundamentally different. How is it that so many smart people fail to understand that? Is it just too complex? Is it willful ignorance? Do they get something out of not understanding it? So what I want to suggest in terms of the different ways of thinking about affirmative action. One, again, is participatory. One is in terms of diversity. One is in terms of correcting the mistakes that we made, the bad habits that we make in terms of our unconscious and our patterns of structures. And the fourth that Elizabeth Anderson spells out is democracy and inclusion. How do we actually build a United States? How do we build an inclusive society? And she would argue, and I would argue, that inclusion and even deciding what are the right mechanisms for to decide how do we distribute what's apparently scarce resources are deeply political questions. They're not test questions. They're not how do you do on a, as a friend might say, a bubble test. It's who we are and who we're going to become as a nation. Now, there's some tactical things we could do. We can say, okay, we're not, the court may constrain our use of race, so we can use other things. We can use geography. And the reason geography works so well is because we're so segregated. We're saying we're using the fact that we're using race in a place that we can't use it. We can use it in another place where we are using it. I mean, it's sort of contradictory when we think about it. The fact that schools in Texas, in San Francisco, in Oakland, are deeply racially and economically segregated is there. The court refuses to acknowledge that. And of course, the parents involved, not only do they not acknowledge it, they say, you can't fix it. We're not going to allow you to fix it. But now when the student is 17 or 18, take a snapshot. We don't want to hear about, what kind of high school they went to. We don't want to hear if they had AP classes. We don't want to hear if they had good teachers. So it's fundamentally incoherent and really dishonest. So I think these are political questions, and like the earlier speaker, I think that ultimately they will be decided politically. Couple of last comments. We are complex, profoundly complex, maybe more complex than the number of atoms in the universe. Race is actually a complex concept. And we're not all situated the same. So race is about our social, structural, political location within society. Not all white people are the same. And in fact, I would say the elites, white and other, are not situated like the rest of us. The elites are strategic. And so if you look at what happened after the election, Newt Gingrich gave a speech before the election. He was scandalized. He was just attacking illegal immigrants, and he called them illegal immigrants. And he was not the worst. There were others who were saying, we should kill these people, build an electric fence, keep them out of our country. They're destroying our country. At a mind science level, we can show that many people were perceived as not human at all. They don't deserve to be here. They're destroying everything good about America. Then there was the election. Newt Gingrich went back on national television, and he said we need to have a pathway to comprehensive immigration and citizenship. And his rank and file base were up in arms. They were saying, 2 weeks ago you were telling us we need to destroy these people. They're not even people. They're terrible. How can you say? He said, get over it. Newt Gingrich is strategic. And so once he sees the election, it's like, okay, that didn't work. What's next? And I believe in some ways that will actually be very significant in terms of affirmative action. That the elite, in terms of how the country, in terms of what we do, the non-elite, will be incredibly instructive. And so I'll end, because my time is up, I'll end by suggesting where Kennedy is. He's in Washington. And he and Scalia, as you know, are 78 years old. It's not wishing ill on anyone, but they both may live out President Obama's term. They will not both live out President Clinton's term. We will have a shift in the court. But let's talk about where Kennedy is right now. Kennedy actually has said he's against he's against balkanization. He's concerned about basically white resentment. And he's trying to parse a different way of thinking about race and affirmative action that doesn't excite resentment. But he hasn't really figured it out. And how he figures this out, both legally but also politically, in part depends on us. And I'll end just by saying it's important to drill down and think what it is we're doing when we talk about race. And one of the speakers asked about the importance of having Obama in the White House. And I'll just say there's very strong evidence right now that the United States is more racially polarized now than before Obama won. That there's more explicit and implicit resentment, anti-black resentment on the part of whites than before Obama was in the White House. And if you look at the voting pattern, we also know that there's an important voting case the Supreme Court is going to hold. The South, on average, only 10% of whites voted for Obama, and over 90% of blacks voted for Obama. How could you be any more racially polarized? And the South is where Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is most present. So we're in this complex place, different places in the country and different places within the white community, black community, Latino community. And I think part of the thing is to embrace this complexity and see if we can build a United States.
I want to thank. Sorry. John, thank you for that. We'll ask you in a minute if you're in a predicting mode, but before Frank speaks, I just want to say one thing about Frank. You know, we're very proud of our diversity here at USF, and I've been touting it as we should. Frank is operating at a public university, and it's a much different context, which you probably will talk about some, but I just want to commend your courage for continuing to fight the good fight in the context that you're working.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I know that everything is being recorded and transcribed. So as the head of a public institution, I will disregard that and go on to say exactly what I otherwise would have said. Let me start with a digression, actually. There's this stereotype, or at least there used to be a stereotype of Asians as polite and deferential. And whenever someone would say to me, "Oh, you Asians, you're all so polite," I would want to give them a very rude gesture. And you might wonder why that is, because it's, after all, seemingly positive, it's complimentary, You know, how thin-skinned could you possibly be, right? It's just like the people who say, "My, you speak English so well," to which my reply is always, "Gee, thanks, so do you." The reason that that compliment, "you're also polite," is troubling is, well, of course, it's a racial stereotype, but polite is two-sided, right? It's double-edged. To be polite is to know your place. To be polite is to not make a fuss. To be polite when people tell you that you are expected to be polite is just a reminder that there are certain constraints. There's a certain etiquette, especially about race. So that's a lead-in to my premise. My premise is we're all too polite, that we are simply too nice when we talk about these issues. And so I'm going to make 3 points very bluntly and very candidly. The first point is that when we talk about race, in the law especially, we like to talk about it with abstract formalism. We like to portray it symmetrically. There's black, there's white, there are racial classifications. Racial classifications are all more or less the same. They're equally morally reprehensible, and so on. I'd like to suggest that that's the first mistake that we make, that when we abstract and formalize, we deliberately take out the real data about the context. That's the whole point of abstract formality, and that is how you end up with symmetry. Race isn't symmetrical at all. And let me just tell you a story. I know there are social scientists in the room, so this is merely a story. It's just an anecdote. I have not done reams of research to back up anything. It's just my little story. But that's also how we see race. Every one of us sees it through this lens of our own history. I spent a decade teaching at Howard University, the nation's leading historically black college. It was life-changing for me. That was a profoundly important place for me to have developed as a thinker. And I learned about race in ways that I could never have learned about no matter what books I read. Just about the privileges I enjoyed, the prejudice that I had, just the life experiences that my colleagues, my students, my friends who are African American had, that I couldn't have imagined at all. But what I want to tell you about teaching at Howard is just a little something about where the color line is drawn and how it gets exposed. So I am not myself black, and I'm not white either. It turns out, though, that if you're Asian American, if you're a newcomer or people think of you as one, you straddle this color line. So in the decade that I was at Howard, not quite every day, but almost every day, somebody would ask me, usually somebody white, would ask me what I was doing there. They would pull me aside when I was introduced as a speaker at a conference or at a cocktail party. They might be a friend of a friend. And they found out what I did, or more accurately, when they found out where I did what I did, which was profess the law, they would, be very puzzled. They'd work themselves up to ask me a series of questions. This is a true story. These questions were all asked of me. They would say things like, you're some sort of radical, aren't you? Or they would say, did you grow up in a black neighborhood? Do you like hip-hop? They would say to me, the black students, what are they like? They would ask, couldn't you get a job anywhere else? And more than once, someone would look me up and down very carefully and then stammer, are you black? Because they were just so puzzled. They expected some sort of story to be told. All right, now what does this reveal? Well, the people asking these questions, these are all sincere people. They weren't overtly bigots. They were just curious. They were intensely curious, right? Because if you're Asian American, you're expected to assimilate, but we never say to what norm. Now, as it happens, during the time that I taught at Howard, I got married. My wife is also a law professor and also Asian American. So for those of you social scientists, I'm not even sampling. I can take the entire universe of married Asian American law professors for this little story. My wife taught across town at another law school in Washington, D.C. That school was historically white. Now, no one called it a historically white school because every school was historically white, but it was white in the sense that if you strolled the halls and looked at the oil paintings or the photos on the wall, they were all of white people. If you looked at who the teachers or the deans were, or until the past generation, everyone who passed through those halls was white, except for the people who cleaned up. Now, my wife had been teaching for longer than I had, so she outranks me, as she points out from time to time. And not once in her entire career as an Asian American teaching at a predominantly white institution did anyone ever pull her aside to say, wow, that must be quite an experience. What's it like being around all those white people? Because it's normal. She was assimilating the way you are supposed to, right? There is nothing remarkable about that. If anything, she was upwardly mobile. But if you're not black and not white, and you make a deliberate choice to affiliate with black people, somehow well-meaning folks, white folks, are just nervous about that, and they demand to know what's going on. You know, why would you do that? So I just share that story because that informs everything that I do. It showed me again and again and again that this isn't symmetrical, that if I put myself in a certain context, that's commendable. I'm congratulated. But if I put myself into a different context, to the ordinary observer, who bears no malice toward me, nor toward African Americans, presumably, that it's at least to them mildly disturbing. So that's my first point, that we should call people on this, that race is not just race. It's not an abstraction. It's not formal. It's not symmetrical. It is not as if the institution of chattel slavery in this nation was colorblind or race neutral. The way that these systems have been set up creates a reality that we function in. Second, there's a common statement. It's made again and again and again. Every time a symposium like this is held, it is said by advocates on both sides. It's said by every commentator when Fisher v. Texas is argued. Everyone feels it important to proclaim. It's obligatory that when you stand up at the podium, you declare, I'm in favor of diversity, I'm not a bigot, right? So there's this desire for us to say, we all want the same goal. Well, here too, I think we're being too polite. We need to say to people, no, you don't. You're just saying that because it's politics, because you realize you can't come and stand at an institution of higher education and say, I'm a white supremacist. That's not a permissible statement today. It was once, 2 generations ago. Well, it's called 3 generations ago. It wasn't just permissible, it was entirely normal. There was much of the United States, not just the Deep South, but the North was explicitly segregated, as was much of the West, where you could hold high office. You could lead an institution of higher education, a corporation. You could run for any number of official positions and declare yourself to be openly bigoted. Well, that's no longer true. So what everyone feels they must do is say, yes, yes, we all want to see a smattering of people, a critical mass. We want African Americans, we want Latinos. Not that we look at race, no, I never noticed that, but I agree with you, just not this way. What concerns me about this is that when you eliminate the ability to consider race in even the most modest manner, you've eliminated the most effective means of achieving the goal. So someone who says they're with you on the goal, but who eliminates all of the reasonable means of pursuing that goal, is not actually someone who agrees with you on the goal. And perhaps from time to time, politely, we should note that. And people aren't naive about political discourse. They notice that. Duplicity does not always prevail. As part of this, I think it's important for us to recognize that these things don't happen automatically. They don't happen magically. There's a wonderful naivete to the way we look at race. We think, well, if I declare myself not to be bigoted, we're done, right? I teach my children not to use the N-word. I've carried out my responsibility as a member of the body politic. The problem, and you've looked at the actual data here, the problem is that this is not today about bigots. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there aren't bigots out there. There are, and we should fight them, and I'm committed to that. What I'm saying is that when we frame this discussion as if it's about the figurative black and white, it's about the villain and the victim, that all we're doing is looking for hardcore bigotry or its remnants, that we do ourselves a disservice, because it allows people to say, well, I'm not a bigot, and how dare you accuse me of being one? So I realize, you know, the way that I do it now when I'm called upon to debate is to concede to whoever I'm debating. That's right, you're not a bigot, but you know what? I am. And indeed, almost everyone I know is. Not because we want to be, but because we have these images rattling around in the backs of our heads. And if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us, even the most progressive, have not, at some point, walking down the street in the Tenderloin neighborhood, for example, where I work, late at night, when you're a little anxious, maybe you've been out, maybe you've had a drink, how many of us have not encountered a stranger in the shadows whom we've seen approaching, and for just a moment had a look of concern, even panic, flicker across our face as we then cross the other side of the street and get our keys out of our pocket and look nervously for our car or for someone else who might be nearby for safety in numbers, because we caught a glimpse of someone who was, yes, young, black, and male. Wearing a baseball cap backward, maybe, if that signified anything. And maybe we meant to cross the street that moment anyway. And that young man can't look into our hearts or our minds. He doesn't know why we looked the way we looked, anxiety-stricken. And we don't know that either. But we jump in our car with great relief and drive home and maybe wonder to ourselves what that was all about. But for that young man, it's not the first time, and it won't be the last time that he sees someone cross the street at precisely the moment that they've spotted him. And how long does it take before a feedback loop is created, where the stereotype is internalized, where people who were not thugs themselves come to perceive that that is how others know them, and that that limits their life choices? So that's my second point. We don't all agree, in part because we've been so successful in civil rights that sometimes the people who disagree most vehemently with us realize they cannot take that position openly. And other times because we're just human beings at the end of the day, and we're good-natured and we mean well about so many things, but that doesn't mean that we can control every thought that we have individually, and it certainly doesn't mean that we can control policies and our collective actions. Third and finally, I'd like to talk about why we have this situation. Why is it that there are angry people who say, well, I went to USF, I went to UC Hastings, I went to Cal, I went to whatever school you want to name, Texas, and I'm now older and my child or grandchild can't get in? There are, I would suggest, 4 reasons for this that have nothing to do with affirmative action, but it's so easy to blame affirmative action. A, things are just more competitive. It is just simply more competitive. The bubble has burst. There's a real feeling that the American dream has lost its luster, and there is good reason to feel that. The United States has had a tremendous post-World War II run, and it's coming to an end. We will live, and our children and grandchildren certainly will live in a multilateral world where the United States still is a beacon of hope and opportunity, but does not enjoy the same material advantage over other nations and other peoples as it once did. And within our own economy, things are just more competitive. It's just harder to get a job out there. So that's part of the reason. B, the percentage of people who go to college has risen dramatically in the past 2 generations. So there are just many, many more people to compete with. C, specifically, there are many more women to compete with, and that's a good thing. And D, there are immigrants and Asian Americans. I've always thought that I would write a little article, 2 articles. One would be entitled, "To All You Asian Americans Who Are Mad About Affirmative Action," and the article would probably just have 1 sentence. It's not the blacks, it's the whites. So that's 2 sentences. Maybe I'd elaborate. The reason you're not getting in is not because of quote-unquote reverse discrimination or quote-unquote racial preferences for African Americans. If you look at virtually every case where Asian Americans are adversely affected, it's because whites are held to a lower standard, not blacks. Then I'd write a little parallel article, which would be called "To My White Friends About Why Your Grandchild Can't Get Into an Elite School." And this really would have 1 sentence. It's the Asians, stupid. That's the answer. So when we look at this, it is not affirmative action. The dynamics that lead us to be so angry have to do with ratcheting up of competition, pursuit of scarce resources, a framing that portrays everything as a zero-sum game, and a heightened awareness, ironically enough, of the importance of status, a heightened sense. This is why I think this is why everyone likes Downton Abbey so much, because we in America now see that we have an upstairs and a downstairs, and for so long we wanted to cling to a myth otherwise. So I'll close with just this thought. The way ahead, I think, is to say to those who would oppose us, you've given speeches in which you've declared that you too care about diversity. Well, let's see you live up to it. Thank you.
I want to thank both Frank and John. No surprise, provocative and eloquent talks. We're going to indulge the audience and stick around for just a little bit because we'd like to get some questions. But can I just exercise a prerogative of the chair? And I'd like to ask each of you, and maybe, Frank, this is easy for you because in some ways maybe you've been operating in what I view a post-Fisher world to be looking like. But I'd also like to ask John, A, are you guys in a predicting mode? And B, should it go the way I think we're kind of thinking it's going to go, although we don't know, but if it does reverse Grutter and Justice O'Connor's opinion, does get swept into the dustbin of history, to use an old phrase, what advice do you give admissions officers who are, and institutions who believe that diversity is a linchpin of an excellent education?
Having said many things that would appall my general counsel in the past 15 minutes, I'll say this. This is, I think, exactly how my lawyers would want me to put it. University of California Hastings College of the Law is fully compliant with California's Prop 209, and therefore will be fully compliant with whatever decision is issued by the United States Supreme Court in Fisher v. Texas. In other words, because Prop 209 passed here in 1996, we've been subjected to the constraints that I think even the most pessimistic would envision would come out of the court. We have done things differently. We have, I think, in our 1L class about 43% people of color, and it hasn't been easy. As to the second question you asked, if I were to predict, I would predict this, that the United States Supreme Court will uphold racial diversity as a compelling state interest. That is, they will say it is an ends that may be pursued. But they will then take such a dim view of the means used to pursue it, specifically the consideration of race, that though it is a permissible, not just permissible, and a compelling state interest, that they leave virtually no means to pursue it effectively.
John?
Well, I agree with much of what Frank said. I think that in a sense that's parents involved. And although, I think a few things. One is that I think whatever's done, and I think it's likely to be bad, but whatever's done will be temporary. Because I do think the court is going to change very quickly. and it's very unstable. We don't have a 9-0 decision. It's not whatever comes out, this country will be deeply contested. California already has equal number of whites and Latinos, more Latino children being born than any other group. It's just not stable to say, you know, you pay tax dollars, but you can't go to college. The other thing that's interesting, and I have noticed that, I mean, when people complain about, well, you know, blacks aren't really qualified, look at the deal on their SATs. At Berkeley, that was pushed. And then, so it's, okay, we're going to rely on SAT tests. And now people are saying, wait a minute, how come all these Asians are getting into Berkeley? Maybe we should have a different test. The test is not really fair. I'm serious, this is actually being considered. Maybe we should rely more on writing. What is it that the Asians are not good at?
It used to be basketball.
Right. Just 2 quick points. Think about this. In terms of the country is about 7% Asian. Interesting, right? The world is over 50% Asian. How do we get that? How do we get a country built on immigration where less than 10% of the world's population, 50% of the world's population land here? Because we excluded them until 1965. I mean, so these legacies we live with every day we don't talk about. So I think the court will uphold a compelling government interest. I think Kennedy, it's hard to say. He may strike down Fisher as applied, but it not have huge implications for other institutions because, in a sense, Texas is in a funny position, right? They have more than one affirmative action plan. You could say the 10% plan is working, and therefore you're getting the necessary diversity, which takes us to the question that Scalia asked: what's the critical mass? Which the lawyer couldn't answer, and I've written a blog on that. So if you want to, but the short answer is the critical mass is not a point. Critical mass comes from physics. Critical mass is when you have an atomic reaction and you get to the point where the reaction takes off. You no longer have to do anything. It's reached a critical mass where it actually is self-perpetuating. So we can think of, if we're trying to create a space where there's diverse dialogue, justice, how much do we have to have there so that it takes off? Another point I want to make, because many of you will be advocates, Scalia asked, so these students are uncomfortable. How do you know they're uncomfortable? We ask them. Oh, you ask them, okay. We don't have to ask. We can test. We can show that this has a huge impact. So the social science and the hard science is coming out is actually in our favor. It's showing that race means much more than what the court is willing to acknowledge. The last thing in terms of going forward, the head of the social department at Harvard, in terms of urban areas, says looking at 3 indicators, you could actually, with 3 indicators, not one, not just SES, but SES, I think the second one is living in concentrated poverty, and the third, I think, is the educational background of your parents. Those 3 indicators intersect. Actually, 93% of the people who meet those 3 indicators are African American. So you can use other indicators to get to the same point. Now, the conservatives on the court have actually have noticed that, and they're saying that's not going to be permissible. But they don't have 4 votes for that. They don't have 5 votes for that. They only have 4. So there are ways. We're clumsy, not as elegant, but there are ways to actually reproduce these things using other indicators without having to say race if we can't say race.
2 great answers. Why don't we give the audience the last shot here? 1 or 2 questions? Anybody? Yes.
First, I just want to thank you guys for being here. I think this is also a lively discussion, and I know that a lot of us in the audience appreciate the opinions that you guys are giving. I'm just curious about, in Grutter, O'Connor at the end, and not all of the court agreed with this, she provided a sunset provision. And I'm wondering what you think Kennedy might do about this 25 years, or will he come up with a different number? Do you think it's going to be an issue at all? I'm just curious what you guys think about that in predicting what the court's going to do.
Well, it won't surprise you, but I thought O'Connor's 25 years was a little ridiculous to begin with. It's like I have a heart palpitation. And I went to my doctor. This was maybe 10 years ago. And he says, you know, it's fine. You can still run. You can still swim. But you need to take a baby aspirin every day. And I said, what about just 25 years? And he said, no. You take it as long as you have the condition. So to sort of come up with a remedy that's not tied to the condition is actually ridiculous. So saying we should examine it in 25 years, that's fine. But we can't predict that we're going to be done in 25 years. People who have serious illness, cancer, whatever, you take the medicine as long as you have the condition. That was a compromise. I mean, it was a way of saying, okay, I'm wink, wink. I don't think the court's going to do a time-sensitive announcement. I think we're beyond that. Kennedy was not happy in the Grutter case, so I think whatever we get, it won't be tied to time.
So this is a common question, right? When does it end? When is it over? How much is enough? Why are we still at this? Didn't we pass Title VII and so on? And whenever people ask me this question, my reply is, I don't think it will end. I don't think it should. And the response to that is always, oh, you're such a pessimist, you're such a cynic. Why do you think we'll have these issues forever? And my thinking is to use a law professor's stock in trade. A law professor analogizes, right, compares. I would propose that diversity is like democracy, right? These are two values of ours that we hold dear, that we hold up as principles, as ideals for others to follow. So think about democracy for a moment. You know, when you go to cast your ballot, if you turn to the person in line behind you and you say, we voted just 2 years ago. What are we doing here again? When is this over? When does this end? You know, I'm just sick and tired of all this voting, you know. They would realize you'd missed an important civics class in high school, right? That somehow you don't get it, right? Which is that democracy is a process. It's not an outcome. We should embrace that. We should revel in it. The whole point is to roll up your sleeves and to take part, to exercise your rights, fulfill your responsibilities, and maybe diversity is a concept like that too. It's participatory, and that's something O'Connor talks about. It's about engagement. It's not a finished product. It's not something you build and put on a shelf and admire. So my response is, I don't think these issues of race, which it seems we so desperately wish to wash our hands of, that they will ever go away. But I don't see that as a negative. That's just part of the human condition, right? And it means that they come back in different forms, that we constantly make progress, but then we set the bar ever higher.
Well, you know, that was, those two responses were such an eloquent way to end that maybe we should end. And let me just say this sentence. It turns out, as I think about this now, that the road to Fisher will take us to Fisher, but it's certainly not the end of the road. So this has just been stunning. And I think it's only fitting, to thank John and Frank. Thank you both. And I think my boss should have the last word. Catherine?
Once again, he has tirelessly supported this symposium today. It would not have existed without him, so thank you so much. I would like to reiterate all my thank yous from this morning to those people. I am deeply, deeply grateful. And I'd also just like to take a second, if we can give all our panelists one more round of applause.